that's the second thing that our gut does, and that's actually secondary to first being a barrier. So I think that's one of the reasons that these ultra processed foods have just been such a dramatic contributor to all of these things that you mentioned. You know, the overeating with the obesity issues, the metabolic issues of the insulin sensitivity, which has ended up causing all of this increase in diabetes now, even at very young ages. Most of it's type 2. All of some of the increases in autoimmunity and allergy that we've been seeing, all of the different issues of the way our vascular disease has evolved, with related to our diet and what's going in the gut. Well, welcome back to what's going to be episode 4 of our series for Forum Health on restoring health, unraveling America's wellness crisis. Today, I'm privileged to be joined by Amy Berke, who is one of our practitioners in Michigan. And in a minute, I'll have her introduce herself. But first, I wanted to mention that this episode 4 is going to be covering the ultra-processed foods and the way that foods in our diet today in America is significantly contributing to this epidemic of chronic disease that we're facing in America. We're going to do a deep dive into nutrition, and we're going to focus on the importance of whole foods and nutrient-dense diets. And so as we get started, I want to remind folks that this series is going to have a few more episodes, and we hope that people that watch these, if you're getting something out of it, please consider following us and also sharing this with friends and family. So as we get into today's episode, I'm going to start off by asking Amy to tell us a little bit about yourself as a practitioner, and what was it that got you involved in this whole area of functional or alternative, non-conventional medical approach.
Yes, thank you. So I'm a functional medicine doctor, as you mentioned. So I work out of Forum Health in Rochester Hills and Clarkston, Michigan. And so before that, and I have been, interested in functional medicine for a long time. I would say, I mean, before I really knew what that term even meant, but back in medical school, I had an interest in it. And I mean, part of it was trying to figure out some of my own health issues. And as many people like kind of go down that path, they're searching for answers. So I started to get more into nutrition myself. So that's very relevant to what we're talking about today. But also, so I started to become exposed to other holistic doctors kind of in the area as I did shadowing, and I saw what they were doing with their patients, and I saw, just their way of looking at it, and their whole approach was so much different than what they were teaching in medical school. And so I kind of became aware there's a different way out there, looking more at the root cause, looking for the deeper issues with people instead of just prescribing and all of that. So so I just kind of, it's been just a process of trying to learn this and understand. And I sought more training and became just totally immersed in functional medicine. I just love to use it to help my patients. And I also, use these principles with my own family as well, and myself. And yeah, so it's just been a journey. Um,
Tell
so
us a
yeah.
little bit about the training, some of the formal training that you've had in functional medicine.
Yeah. So, well, my first real experience with it was, I guess it was more getting thrown into it, to be honest. Because I was so dead set on doing functional medicine, but we weren't trained in medical school residency. I mean, I was doing my own research, but that wasn't really teaching me enough. But I did find a job that, another functional medicine doctor in the area was looking for somebody else to bring in, and then they they took me on, knowing I was pretty green and everything, but I was trained in biotoxin illness by Dr. Shoemaker. So I did that training and I worked with patients that had mold toxicity, um, as well as other areas of functional medicine, hormone replacement and managing thyroid conditions, adrenal fatigue, gut problems. And then, so it all kind of just, I started to learn a lot there. I was learning from that physician that, he was mentoring me, but also under Dr. Shoemaker. And, but then, I kind of, it didn't fully take off from there. So I ended up going into primary care actually after that experience. And so I have had years of being a family physician. Basically, like I was doing that for about 7 years, and I was just kind of getting increasingly fed up with the way things were. While I was practicing integrative medicine, it was so constraining with only being able to spend like less than 15 minutes with my patients when they had all these complicated issues and layers of problems. And we, obviously had hardly any time to talk about things like nutrition, which we're barely trained in anyways, like as far as in medical training. Of course, I've, done so much of my own research in that area that, I'm very confident in it. But yeah, so I also had additional training with Dr. Daniel Kalish, the Kalish Institute of Functional Medicine. So that was another thing that really just kind of tied a lot together for me and gave me a good foundation in functional medicine. And then it just continues to evolve. And but that was another experience that really kind of gave me more of the bigger picture, because you don't learn this stuff in med school or residency. You have to seek out other resources. Unfortunately, there's not a functional medicine residency, right? Which I wish there were something like that. You either do like primary care or specialize. Everybody's just kind of funneled into these things, and not everybody in medicine is aware that this is an option. So,
You know, we might get into a little bit later about the Flexner report, which
mhm,
was some work that was done at the request of Rockefeller way back in around 1915 or something like that. But basically, that was what kind of got medicine off in the direction it is today of really going away from anything natural in
mhm,
academic training for medicine. They closed down a lot of medical schools that weren't based off of drug therapy for the most part. And so it's sort of been a tradition in allopathic medicine. Maybe, who knows, maybe someday there actually will be schools that are more directed toward the whole concept of functional root cause medicine. I mean, we can always hope for that. And I think maybe with some of the changes we're seeing at the national level, politically, we might even hope that some of this may be just around the corner. But as you mentioned, without asking you to contribute personally, I know you have a family, and I'm sure
mhm.
that some of these issues have been really big in terms of your own personal life as a mother.
Yeah. I mean, the issues like with you're saying with like the ultra processed food, or just
Yeah,
like
concerns
medicine in
concerns
general.
about what
Yeah.
you're feeding your family.
Oh yeah. I mean, yeah. So I mean, my journey with nutrition, yeah, started a long time ago. I did want to go into this, and yeah. So yeah, basically, I mean, I want to talk about myself. That's fine. I'll talk about it a little. Um, yeah, I mean, I was raised on a standard American diet, basically, like so many other people, as we'll get into, and it's just getting worse and worse. But, I grew up in the 80s and 90s, and mostly the 90s, I guess. And so that was when that was really booming, and that was really like basically everywhere. The ultra processed food were everywhere, and I think back to the foods that I ate, like typical kids cereal, like Fruity Pebbles and Corn Pops and all that junk. And then, of course, with 2% milk, and then, eating like a typical kid school lunch. And then I was addicted to pop, like Pepsi and Coke, for pretty much as long as I can remember. And so my parents, they didn't know any better maybe at the time. And, that's maybe for a lot of reasons that was what was that was sort of the normal thing back then in a way. And that was, some of these things, as we will find out, they were being told that this is healthy, at least all these servings of carbohydrates and all these refined foods, and these healthier fats like vegetable oils, right? That we were told that that whole the whole lie about fats, of course. But anyway, so I was raised on this diet, and I did experience negative things from this. I mean, of course, it's going to affect you on some level. That I was developing hormone imbalances and PCOS and other gut issues and candida issues and other layers of probably adrenal fatigue. For sure, I was very tired back then. And so, it wasn't until I started to, piece things together, I started to realize, at first my journey led me to pursuing like more of a vegetarian diet, because that was something that, I had other people who influenced me were following that. And so it was, I think in a way, I'm not necessarily an advocate for a vegan or vegetarian diet, but at the time it took me off of a processed diet. And I think that was maybe the reason that I felt somewhat better with it. But over time, I didn't really get a hold of my hormone issues until I started to follow more of a more of a what I consider an ancestral diet, or one with with plenty of saturated fats and healthy fats, and of course, still eliminating all of the ultra processed foods out of the diet and the sugars. But I started getting more interested in the Weston A. Price Foundation dietary recommendations, and it kind of helped me to and getting into making bone broth and things like of that nature. And so that led me down that path, and that I felt that really helped me with correcting some of my own issues. And I did see a change where, all of a sudden I went from, my whole life having like maybe 3 or 4 cycles a year to having regular cycles. So obviously that was a dramatic change that I saw with that. And and then my understanding of diet has evolved more in that. And there's not a one size fits all, I think, with diet completely, but that did help me. And then also um there are other diets that I think are provide similar benefits. And but finding the right one for each person, of course. But yeah, but fundamentally a lot of them share this a common threads, which center I do think that, yeah, meat is overall healthy for people. And so yeah, that's some of the background and how I
Yeah,
came to.
I think it's exciting that, you have that your own personal perspective, that you've actually made some of these changes based on what you've learned, and it's made a difference in your own life, in so many
Yeah.
different ways. That makes it exciting. I know a lot of the providers that I've worked with over the years, especially since I made the change from being an ear, nose, and throat surgeon to being a environmental medicine specialist. that many of my colleagues have those personal stories of illness, either themselves or a close family member, and they just weren't getting answers, through the traditional routes of medical information and working with other providers. And that kind of is what forced them into that. But certainly the benefits that you've seen in your own life is something that we want to mention now, that, part of the purpose of this episode and the series overall is that we're going to be talking not only about issues that are directly clinical, in other words, things that people can know and maybe change or be aware of that can make a difference, but also we're probably going to be talking at least somewhat about some of the public policy issues of maybe the laws and the things that we've traditionally learned to do that have brought us to this place, and that can probably over time be changed, especially if the right incentives are put into place. So we'll be talking more about that. But I hope too that we can provide hope for people, because I think you'll probably agree, Amy, that these things that we're talking about do make a difference for people. One of the reasons I know that I like to do this as a career is that we do see these results, and we do see people that we get a chance to interact with that have really not gotten answers and have really not learned things that they need to know to see changes in their own lives or in the lives of their personal, family and friends. But would you say that you've seen that since you've been practicing in this way?
Oh yeah. I feel like it's overall, partly I feel like what we're doing is helping to change people's awareness of, what is, um, going into them, and also what's coming out. And but also, yeah, so just it's a completely different framework of, yeah. I mean, but it's a relationship with the patient, and instead of it being, I'm telling you what to do, I am, giving you this and this is going to fix you. This is a mutual understanding, a relationship, that a partnership that we have with the patient, and really making the treatment more individualized, and but working together, because really I think when it comes down to it, the patient is healing themselves on a level, and we're just kind of guiding them through this, and providing some of the some of our resources and teachings to push them in the right direction, but a lot of the work comes from the individual person. So yeah.
Yeah, so just a little quick background on me, which I've mentioned in some of the other episodes, but I trained traditionally in Texas as an ear, nose, and throat surgeon. And I did that the first part of my career. I was active duty Army. And while I was doing that, it was great. I mean, we were following all the regular guidelines and protocols that I'd been taught in medical school and residency. After that, I went to Colorado and started practicing there with a group of well, it was a multi-specialty group, but I started seeing people back in the 80s that had widespread disease. Usually when they came to see me, it was because they had some specific ear, nose, and throat problem. Like maybe it was ringing in the ears, or it was sinus problems, or maybe they had vertigo and dizziness and unsteadiness, something to do with the head and neck. Sometimes it was even tumors. But as I was treating these people, as I had been taught conventionally, it started to become pretty obvious to me that for many of these people, there was something else going on. It turned out that I was practicing in a kind of a rural farming and ranching community, and it seemed like some of my sickest patients that I was encountering were actually being exposed to a lot of agricultural chemicals, some of them ranch chemicals. I also was starting to see particularly ladies that worked in the house cleaning field, and were around a lot of chemicals in their daily lives, and even some people, some ladies and guys that were involved in the salon industry, hair, and
Mhm.
were being exposed to a lot of chemicals in that regard. And it started to become pretty obvious to me that these chemical exposures were pretty dramatic in terms of acting as root causes in the progressive development of symptoms, not just in the ear, nose, and throat, but involving their whole bodies, whether it was their hormones or their gut or their anxiety, depression, cognitive, brain fog, memory loss, many different areas. So that was kind of what, first of all, got me to open my eyes to the fact that what I had learned as a traditional surgeon wasn't going to be enough. If I was really wanting to get these people well, we had to understand what was going on so that we could really get into it. So, not saying any more about me, but I would like to ask you, why don't you start us off by telling us from your personal perspective, what's meant by the term ultra processed foods, and
Mhm.
how does it impact our health?
Sure. Okay. So I tend to think of these foods as, foods that are made by industry. And so they're basically manufactured types of foods. They often contain several ingredients combined together. So, there's this idea that um, these foods, often containing really cheap ingredients to maximize profit. But so we start with like individual types of components, let's say soy or corn, stripped down to individual food groups like sugar, fats, and oils. Okay. Then it's combined with other food additives, which are often toxic. And then they use a lot of these types of tech processing techniques to mash it all together, I guess, and create this kind of very what they call hyper palatable food, or like to kind of hijack our reward system, I think, in a way, and make it very addictive. Okay, so that's
Addictive.
part of the
Yeah, go ahead,
yeah.
say it. I think that's the deal.
Yeah, so, and then there's yeah, so that's actually, that's a point in all of this, that this food is highly addictive. It does create a tendency to overeat as well. Okay, so and we know that these foods, through the research and everything, that they're linked with a lot of chronic health conditions, which we'll get into, right? But that we see, but there's concerns on many levels, I think, with it. Okay, one is these additives are, many of them are toxic. And they use them, like, per se, to maybe to enhance flavors, to their dyes. Okay, so we have dyes, we have emulsifiers, we have preservatives, so obviously things to extend the shelf life as well. So it's all kind of to either, I think, make it more addictive or make it cheaper to make on some level.
I
Okay,
think
and
the word that you said that probably got my attention the most was profit.
yeah.
I think if we really sit back and take a hard look at most of the things we're going to talk about today, it kind of boils down to is somebody going to financially benefit,
Mhm.
from many of these decisions that are made. I also like the fact that you talked about at the very beginning that it was kind of chemically prepared food, or by industry. A lot of people these days are talking more about going back to real food. What's been your experience there? I mean, do y'all have farmers markets up where you live?
Oh yeah, we do. I mean, so I'm in Michigan, and we don't have it year round because of the weather. But we during the warmer months, we have farmers markets, and I mean, I do make an attempt to eat more locally as well, for sure. When it's a possibility. Um, we have there's food co-op type of scenarios too that I belong to that also, like, do food pickup, where from local farms, they kind of coordinate some of the local meats, and then there are some markets that cater to that as well. Um, but yeah, that's, I feel, very important as well, to try to eat locally and eat organically, of course, because the other issue with these foods is obviously, they are often like, they're not typically organic. A lot of them are using genetically modified ingredients. Um, and therefore they're going to be containing pesticides and herbicides, which are also toxic as well. I think the toxicity part of this is, I think, very important, as to why it's potentially so bad for our health. But yeah, because so yeah, whenever we can, choose to eat more whole foods and locally, I'm all for that. And so what about you guys? You have a good
Yeah,
availability
we
of
we
that kind?
do. We try to definitely shop farmers markets when we can get access to them, and we have some of those same food co-ops, and we've been involved in those, not just for vegetables and fruits, but sometimes even for meats. To get
Mhm.
grass-fed, organically grown beef and chicken and eggs and that sort of thing. We try to get as much as we can organic, when we shop at the grocery store, even though it's clearly more expensive, and it kind of depends in a way on how you define organic. There's some things that meet the official definition of organic that when you really look at the way it's prepared, it may not be as safe and pure as you think. But
Right.
you know, I really feel like when I'm taking care of people that have multiple signs and symptoms of illness, and we start talking about changing their eating plan, which is one of the first things that I always do with my patients. I mean, I think we see real quick benefits. I think we start seeing changes that are almost immediate. In fact, most of the people I would say that come in to see me have already been to see a lot of other providers and haven't gotten answers. And I always ask them, well, have you done anything to change your eating plan? And most people will tell me that they have. A lot of my patients will say right away, well, I quit eating gluten and it made a real difference for me, right away. Or they might say, I quit eating as much sugar in my diet or as much sweets, and it made a real difference for me. So, I mean, I think in my experience, getting away from processed foods and maybe some of the diet traditions or eating traditions that we have in America. You mentioned the standard American diet, which we sometimes abbreviate SAD or SAD. Yeah, it's really, I think it's something that we need to think about. But even the traditions of eating in America were kind of largely based on some decisions that were motivated by profit. If we look at the old food pyramid from the American Dairy Association and the FDA, I mean, it goes back as far as that. And I think I heard you mention something about the way we were kind of misled about fats and processed
Yeah.
foods and so forth. I think there's many examples of how industry, again, probably for profit motives, have really gotten us where we are, even in terms of what we eat when we try to eat real healthy foods. But what's been your experience more specifically in the way that eating processed foods or food that's not ideal for our system has contributed to chronic illness? I know I heard you say, for example, digestive. What's been some of your experience there?
Well, yeah. So these foods, I mean, being that they are kind of, a lot of the time, they are containing high levels of refined sugars and artificial sugars, as well as industrial seed oils, is a common feature. Um, so, these ingredients, obviously, highly inflammatory. We know that, and then how, they're, since they're addictive and people are overeating them, it often is leading to insulin resistance, and So, which is also linked with obesity. It's also been shown that these foods are contributing to obesity as well as a number of other health conditions. But so, I think ultimately, yeah, there's so many health effects. I think it is also being studied how they're having impacts on the microbiome and how they're changing some of the microbiome, which is like the balance of hopefully good bacteria in your gut. Um, and so we see it, I think, on so many levels, like with, um, yeah, also, yeah, I'd like to kind of go back to talking about maybe that myth of saturated fats in the diet and how that was, all started, right? So a lot of this, I think, has been going on for maybe, at various points over the last 100 years. All these kind of efforts to try to shape the American diet into something that it was not, like again, deviating away from um, animal protein as being kind of the mainstay of the diet, and just a more traditional diet. So I think all of that has been going on, and like you mentioned, there was the whole issue like in the 1950s with Ansel Keys, right? He was one of the earlier proponents that saturated fat caused heart disease, the diet heart hypothesis. And so there was like a large study done, but everybody now understands how flawed that was. But regardless, that became heavily promoted and pushed on the American people as to that saturated fat should be avoided, and it is linked to heart disease and all these other negative health outcomes and all of that. And so, but the motivation for that really, I think, came from the industry. Okay. The industry was trying to, take these cheaper industrial oils and find actually some of them were just literally byproducts of industry that we would consider toxic byproducts that we would not have normally considered human, for human consumption. And so they had to find ways to. An example of that is Crisco. Okay, so Crisco was actually derived originally. It's been changed over time, but originally it was cottonseed oil. And so this was a waste product at the time, and they had to find a way. They wanted to find a way to use it, and so they developed basically Crisco, which is and then so they're saying, this is a heart healthy oil as opposed to fats that come from animals. And so this was the start of that. There's a lot of other examples in that, but um so it's been demonized for a long time, and that still exists today. I feel like that same, this has been debunked, for a long time. I think, the research has shown that this is not true, and that saturated fat doesn't directly cause heart disease. But this is still in the minds of the American people that somehow it was so heavily promoted. And then, like you said, there was the whole food pyramid in the 90s, which, also I consider sort of a marketing tool, okay, for all these, forces that again, like profit driven industry corporation that wanted people to consume lots of carbohydrates, because obviously the base of the food pyramid is like 6 to 11 servings of uh, of carbs or grains or refined or otherwise. But so there's been these things over time that have, um, molded the consciousness of America to believe that margarine is better than butter, and all these other things that are now, as we're understanding, have been just devastating on our health.
Yeah, I'm a little older than you are, but I remember as a youngster that my mom started bringing and putting on the table these sticks of what we used to call oleo. Had you ever heard that term oleo before?
No.
Yeah, oleo was what we used to call the butter in those days. And I can't
Okay.
remember what it stood for. It was a chemical name, oleic or something like that. They just called it oleo for short. But it was brought out probably in the 50s, maybe even earlier than that, as a substitute for butter. And of course, it was much, much less expensive. And of course, it was made directly from petroleum. It was
Mhm.
petroleum byproduct. And it was made to seem so much more healthy than, and all the reasons that butter was so bad for us and everything. But yeah, and then later on they started calling it margarine and advertising more that it was from corn and that sort of thing. But yeah, in my practice, Amy, I always tell my patients that there definitely is a connection between what happens in our guts and everything else having to do with all of the different signs and symptoms of chronic illness. And when people say in functional medicine it starts in the gut, I mean, I think there's definitely truth to that. And so I feel like it's an issue with what is our gut supposed to do for us really? And I tell my patients it's basically pretty simple that there's really only two main things that our gut needs to do for us. And the first thing, which I think is the most important thing, is something that a lot of people don't even probably think of as the most important thing, but it's to be a barrier, I believe. Our gut is supposed to be a barrier. It's supposed to keep things that we eat and swallow not in our bodies, but to not get into our systems. And so barrier function. And if we don't have proper barrier, that's what people in lay medicine would talk about as leaky gut. And I actually tell my patients that I believe that 100% of all of us humans have leaky gut, at least to some degree. It's really only a matter of the degree of it. Of course, many of my patients have an extreme amount of leaky gut where their guts don't play this permeability or barrier function the way they're supposed to. And then I always tell my patients that the second most important thing that our gut does, and that's to allow us to take in all the other things that our cells need to be optimally healthy. Whether it's the calories, the proteins, the sugars, the fats, or if it's the minerals or the nutrients. That's the second thing that our gut does, and that's actually secondary to first being a barrier. So I think that's one of the reasons that these ultra processed foods have just been such a dramatic a contributor to all of these things that you mentioned. The overeating with the obesity issues, the metabolic issues of the insulin sensitivity, which has ended up causing all of this increase in diabetes now, even at very young ages. Most of it's type 2. All of some of the increases in autoimmunity and allergy that we've been seeing, all of the different issues of the way our vascular disease has evolved, with related to our diet and what's going in the gut. But yeah, I think it's huge. And I think that's why you can start to see changes in people almost immediately that they start changing their diet. I know for one thing, in Forum Health, we've got the GDRX program, which has
Mhm.
only been going now for 5 or 6 years, but now we've done some real research looking at large numbers of people who have gone through that program, and I've seen it to be pretty positive. What's been your experience on that? Do you use that in your practice?
Well, I haven't used that program um completely. I do something kind of similar, but, along the same lines, but my elimination diet is slightly different, but overlaps quite a bit with GDRX. So I started to use like a paleo elimination diet. And so, you know, um, I've had, like, I think it's probably achieving a similar result, probably. But it's, the idea that, going along with what you said, I mean, most of my patients have a leaky gut and increased intestinal permeability, and that's so common with, people with chronic conditions that we're working with. And so in order to take some of the stress off of the body and, for one, to teach them how to eat healthier, I do agree with, in the beginning, taking people off of inflammatory foods. So if they're willing, of course. And so if they're motivated and willing to do that. So, we attempt to do, um, I attempt to do a grain-free diet with them for 30 days, grain-free and dairy-free. And it also removes legumes. Of course, it removes these kinds of ultra processed foods that we're referring to, and sugar. And so I have, it's kind of a lot of overlap, and it's just a little more paleo centered, which, because the GDRX is not 100% on that. But yeah, so, and I feel like, people, often, I think it's important for people to start with the diet on many levels, because that's what's going to maintain their health over a longer period of time. It's not necessarily about, giving them supplements. That, I mean, supplements are supplemental to the diet. I see that as, um, the supplements are important and they are helpful, of course, but what's going to keep them healthy after they get off these supplements is going to be their nutrition, their diet, and then keeping their microbiome healthy as well, because that is, as you know, something we focus a lot on, in functional medicine. And being that a lot of inflammation comes from the gut, or curing chronic infections in the gut, or overgrowth of yeast, or curing parasites, all of that, which creates kind of this body-wide inflammation. In addition, the huge portion of the immune system that is part of our gut as well, that it's more than half of the immune system. And so, and I think, do you see a lot of, and I think that is such an important thing about it, about healing the gut, is how it affects the immune system, because you feel like a lot of your patients have like some level of like immune dysregulation, and that's like one of their underlying
Yeah,
issues.
I would say that in my practice of environmental medicine, we need to have a really good discussion of what does it mean, inflammation.
Mhm.
Inflammation which comes from the immune system. If you had no immune system, you would have no inflammation. Now, inflammation definitely serves a purpose in our bodies. That's why we evolved that process. The problem is when the inflammation isn't properly regulated, when we aren't able to turn it off, then we basically start to talk about the concept of immune self-injury, which is a term I like to use instead of inflammation, because it's a little bit more broad spectrum. We talk about histamine and the role that histamine plays, that it was evolved to kill parasites by our bodies coming from cells in our immune system, but that histamine is just as able to kill us if we get an overdose, which is basically what happens when a person dies of anaphylaxis. They actually die of histamine toxicity from their own histamine. But again, it's just an example of how the immune system ends up causing problems. And I like to tell my patients that the immune system isn't doing it on purpose. I mean, the immune system is basically trying desperately to protect them from some perceived threat. It's just that in the process of doing it, they end up getting hurt. In the end, they end up developing symptoms. I like to have people think of immune self-injury as almost like friendly fire in a war, that your immune system is fighting, it's releasing these various mediators, you can call them bullets, and that because they're there for a reason, a good reason, but at the same time, they can end up causing damage to our own cells and tissues, and that's where the problem comes in. But yeah, I know in my practice, a lot of times when we start talking about the eating plan that a person needs to consider to try to get well, and that's usually one of the first things we always talk about. Some people, I have to explain to them that in my way of thinking, um, there's no such thing as a detox cleanse. Some people will say, yeah, I do a detox cleanse, at least once every quarter, 2 weeks I do it. I buy it in a box, it comes, I do
Mhm.
it, and I'm cleansed. And I always just kind of chuckle and say, no, really our eating plan should be our way of cleansing every single day. And again, it goes back to what we were talking about, not getting in the toxins that we don't want, but yet getting in all the nutrients that we do want. But sometimes it can be appropriate to do more intensive programs over shorter periods of time. And that's basically what the GDRX was designed to be, as just a short period, anywhere between 2 and 5 weeks of a little bit more restrictive eating plan, like you mentioned, elimination diet, which, yeah, we eliminate some of the things that we know are more likely to cause problems. And then we also add in some nutrients and some other things, most of which are natural, to try to really build up that intestinal integrity and prevent that hyperpermeability and try to get things off on the right foot. And I have definitely seen the GDRX program to be able to do that. But I always tell my patients, that's a temporary, think of that as pushing a reset button. But I still want you to eat in a way that's going to nourish your body and prevent you from being exposed to toxins, forever. I mean, I think that's what we all should be doing to stay healthy. And again, a sick person, I tell them, if we can get you completely well, then we just talk about a wellness program, but it actually doesn't sound a lot different than what we're going to talk about to get you well anyway. But so why don't we talk a little bit about maybe, and this would probably get into some public policy a little bit, but
Mhm.
why do you think why do you think we're having these issues of ultra processed foods in the first place? And what are some of the things that we maybe need to look at as a nation to try to start to turn things around?
Well, okay, so I think that we touched on it a little bit. Why so you're asking why it's so prevalent in a
But yeah,
way?
what do we do about it?
In
I mean, maybe what are some of the big picture things that we need to be
Yeah,
thinking about? Like you and I, we're
yeah,
the government in the sense that what we believe our country needs for us, we're supposed to be able to tell our representatives what that looks like. So, what
yeah.
are some of the ideas that you think we need to try to carry forward to those people that are up in the ivory
In the
tower
upper in the
vision?
regulate yeah, in
Yeah.
politics and things. Well, if it were up to me, I think that it just needs a complete, makeover, I guess, in other words,
Yeah,
but,
what would President
um
Berke say about it?
oh gosh. Yeah, I think I would be a good choice in a lot of ways. But no, really, yeah, I mean, there's just so much like as we've already mentioned that this industry is it comes down to profit, I think, at the expense of people's health ultimately, and it doesn't, there is a lot of corruption when it comes down to it, with these big food, big agriculture, big pharma, how they all kind of collude together in order to create this sort of sense that this is what is normal, and this is the way of life for Americans, and this is what we eat here. Um so I think that they're just basically, their motivations are sinister. And I mean, because you can kind of see how um it starts with our kids, right? Like these a lot of these products are marketed towards children. And that there's a high proportion that of the foods that children eat are ultra processed. And I mean, I've heard anywhere around like 70% of the diet is ultra processed, which is frightening. And so, I think that by getting people hooked on this young, it it's kind of getting them sort of set up for this lifetime of health issues that um you know but also that just as they're consuming all of these foods, they're making money off of them throughout their lifetime. And then now, once they develop the health issues, now they're getting plugged into um the medical establishment, and conventional medicine has a solution for them, and it's usually in the form of a pill. And these underlying reasons as to why this all happened is sort of shoved under the rug, or it's sort of, or it's not, again, like how much time does a primary care doctor have to go into a person's diet with them, and then their lack of understanding and their lack of education on it to begin with, um, is just perpetuating this vicious cycle that is really unsustainable. And it seems like it's making people sick at an alarming rate. And people are the rise in chronic disease during all of this push has just escalated at a huge and alarming rate. And so it's really not, this isn't really even sustainable, because everybody is going to be sick at some point or another. The majority of people are going in this country are going to be sick and dependent on pharmaceuticals, and which are possibly just creating a band-aid, which then create a number of other negative health effects too, as we see many, one drug creates many other side effects. And so you're saying, how do we fix all this?
Well, yeah, like
So
one thing just to consider, it seems like the policies coming from the top for ultra processed foods in America are quite a bit different than the policies in a lot of the other
mhm.
countries in the world. Why don't you comment to that?
Yeah. So there is a big difference between um, the number of additive food ingredients, for example, that are allowed in America versus other countries. Not the in, so more so um, like I think in the United States, it's somewhere between 10,000 to 15,000 food additives um, are being used. And then whereas in the UK, it's a very small amount. I mean, I've heard different numbers from different sources, but it's
It's hundreds
it's
instead
much
of
lower.
thousands.
Hundreds, yeah, hundreds, like 400 or something like that. So it's yeah. So there's a sort of there's this, to me it's kind of crazy as I've learned about what is actually happening, because the regulating agencies that are supposed to be deeming these ingredients safe are not actually doing studies on each individual ingredient and determining, okay, this is safe for human consumption. It's sort of I've heard it put, a innocent until proven guilty
There
type
you
of
go. Well, just like our
scenario where,
system of justice, right? I mean, in America, aren't you
well,
innocent until proven guilty?
right.
Shouldn't that apply to
Yeah,
these
that's
food
true.
additives as well? Whereas in
Yes.
Europe, they take just the opposite approach.
Exactly. Yeah. So they're guilty until they're proven to be safe in Europe. Um, so there's a stark difference. And not only that, so well, what is apparently the case is that it's on the food industry themselves to prove safety. Okay, so obviously there's no bias there, right? There's no invested interest in them saying that okay, these ingredients that they're selling are safe. So if you, I think that it really is very corrupt. There's no other better way to say that the people that are supposed to be regulating them are taking money from them, are basically funded, FDA, USDA, all of that. Then when it comes down to also promoting the dietary guidelines themselves, that is also sort of an issue with funding and who is doing these studies and how is this being pushed again, like the good, the food pyramid is a good example of that. And um so that was I consider a marketing tool, because that's framing the way that we what they want us to be eating basically. And but this has been going on so many levels for so long that it's just it's just hard to figure out. I think what has to happen is that there has to be a separation of obviously the people that are regulating them and the people that are making the foods and determining what is safe and what is not safe. But since they're being funded by them, it's impossible for them to be unbiased in this.
Mhm. So I think, you've really emphasized the whole concept of corruption and corporate capture and bias and conflict of interest. I mean, I think these are the principles that we're dealing with, and I think these are the principles that we really need to focus on. How do we reverse? Well, for one thing, we've talked a lot, not we, you and I, but that America, we've talked for ever since President Eisenhower in 1961, when he gave his final speech as a president. He told the Americans that we needed to watch out for the industrial or the military industrial complex. And if we weren't careful, that we were going to find that we were going to get involved in forever wars just for the sake of generating profit for the uh, arms manufacturers. And I think we've all seen that. I mean, I think we deal with that every day now today as we worry about the possibility of going into World War III. But since then, a lot of people have been talking about the medical industrial complex or the food industrial complex. And I think many of the same factors are at play there. And for example, one thing I would say is if you study who owns these big conglomerate food producers now, a lot of them are directly related to the roots of the tobacco industry from the
Mhm.
60s. And, for years, they fought the government and the American public about the dangers of tobacco to our health. And finally, I think we can say that the tobacco companies more or less lost that fight. But what did they do instead? They just decided to acquire the food companies, you know, and then they brought the same kind of corruptive, adverse conflict of interest approach to agency capture and all these other ways, the way that they've funded campaigns of our elected officials, the way the lobbying efforts that goes on in Washington to pretty much just get us to where we are today. And I think those are the things we need to talk about. How do you unwind?
Yeah, so also that's a good point that they brought over their scientists. Okay, so the scientists that were originally there to make cigarettes more addictive for people, they just moved them over to food, and so that's one of the threads of why the food is also designed to be addictive as well. So And then, I mean, also, so there's like the bigger picture of why, why this is, I think, pushed on the American people from all of the media perspective and from the biased research perspective and all of that. But so the other perspective is the at the individual level, I think, of why do people make these choices day to day as to why are they eating it? Um, why is it so prevalent in that way? And so from there, I think that it's also there there are these financial constraints because this food is also much cheaper than eating whole foods and healthier foods options. And so I think that's a factor is that we have to realize that a lot of people can't or feel like they can't afford to eat better. Um, and then I just think on some level, mentally, when you are eating these foods and your health is not optimized because of them, and you're starting to develop, chronic conditions. I feel like maybe the judgment can be cloudy, and then you get into these emotional eating patterns of when you're have all these other issues, you might end up being anxious or depressed, and then you might be seeking comfort in these foods and using it in that way. And then there is just the underlying aspect that it is addictive, as we just were mentioning. And so it's just being hit on so many levels. Um, and I just don't think that this information is always getting out to people because of the corruptive aspects of this and how a lot of media is kind of controlled by um, the people who paid for advertising, which is a huge proportion of that is big pharma. So when we look at it, they don't really necessarily want all this information on actually what is healthy to be getting out and it being mainstream. Of course, I think there's a movement for sure that more people are waking up to it, and since we have the internet and people can do their own research and find out more answers, that there are more people that are wanting to actually they're realizing the impact that this has had on them, and they're wanting to get healthy and learn about what real nutrition is.
Amy, do you know Casey and Callie Means?
Yeah, I've come across some of their their
Yeah,
I was watching
brother and
the round
sister.
table. Yeah, I was watching that round table with Robert F. Kennedy, and they were on there. That was the first I've been exposed to them. Yeah.
Yeah, there was
Ro-
also a really good Senate hearing that Senator Ron Johnson, I think he's from Minnesota, that he
okay.
held, I think it was back in September, maybe October, where
Okay.
he brought quite a few people that were advocates for healthy food and getting away from processed food and talking about some of the public policy issues. But I can highly recommend that people take a look at that. It was about a 3 hour hearing, and there was like 15 people that made short presentations, but well worth the view. And it's if you just look at it, I know it said American Nutritional Health, a second opinion that he held in Washington. I know that Robert Kennedy was one of the people that presented, but also Callie and Casey Means presented there too. But I know one of the things they were talking about was this concept of agency capture, and the fact that some of these three-letter agencies like the CDC and the NIH and the ADA and the FDA, a lot of these are basically staffed by non-elected and in many cases non-appointed. They're just lifetime employees of these agencies. Many of them are scientists, some of them are attorneys, others are just more administrative positions. But it seems like that a lot of the problem goes back to these agencies and the fact that they are tasked with overseeing what's going on with these food companies and so forth, and the way we treat farmers and ranchers in America. And yet, by the same token, they seem like they've got some conflict of interests, and it's very difficult to try to change that. I do think that that's one of the things that they've been talking about, this Department of Governmental Efficiency that they're trying to get going in the new administration. And I know one of the things they've been talking about is some of these lifelong appointments to some of these three-letter agencies, that maybe if they could change some of this, some of the staffing patterns, some of the patterns of oversight at the upper levels, that we might be able to see some difference. What's your opinion about that?
I think, yeah, that would be a start, I guess. I I believe that, yeah, I don't believe that they should, they're not doing a very good job right now, so they should probably, get out of there, if this is the outcome that we are facing right now with this health crisis, then yeah, then that could be a good start as far as, making it more, honest and transparent and, just letting, yeah, making people aware of actually how this works too, and so that people can get kind of start getting upset about it and maybe making other choices, maybe like not buying these foods intentionally and boycotting them themselves would also have an impact, I think. But again, yeah, like if we can take the corruption out of the regulating agencies, and make them less biased, then we have at least a starting point, for really, trying to reverse the situation.
You mentioned too about the science. Um, I was having a discussion with somebody, even about fluoride. And we were talking about the fact that there had been some pretty valid recent scientific studies that had been published suggesting that fluoride is a human neurotoxin, and that over time it can even contribute to lowered IQs. Um, and yet at the same time, that individual I was talking to was citing some papers that were basically saying that fluoride was perfectly safe, and that it was actually a way to reduce dental caries and reduce and improve dental health. But I think, can you speak to that as far as the science? Because I think that's where
Okay.
a lot of the confusion comes in, that people don't know what to believe. We see that same kind of thing coming up in the whole vaccine debate.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good question. I think it is, there is, people are getting messages, mixed messages in both directions. Um, but I think that from my understanding, I feel like the fluoride thing is um sort of, more black and white, and that, I feel like the research has shown that it is a potentially, like, that it is a neurotoxin, and, these issues with, like, lowering the IQ, so I mean, I tend to just, I tend to think that, even if there is mixed evidence on it, if it potentially does those things, I'd rather avoid it, right? Just out of caution and common sense. And, to me, there's also the issue with fluoride affecting thyroid function. So being that, iodine is displaced by fluoride as well, out of the thyroid receptors, and, because it looks chemically similar to it, being that it's like in the same, um,
Halogen?
kind of halogen type of, yeah, halogen type of molecule in the same row of the periodic table. And, so we see that with toxins like fluoride and bromide and chlorines, which are also really ubiquitous in the environment, that it's damaging thyroid health. And, you know, or maybe even acting as a trigger for autoimmune thyroid issues like Hashimoto's. And so I think I just always advocate to avoid fluoridated water. Um, Even if I think that, going back to research, it just depends on who's doing the research. What's the research industry itself, it's not perfect, and there are certain biases. I would like to think that that we all follow this idea of doing no harm, and really just trying to seek the truth. But I just feel like that, that's just not how research really is. That people have sort of underlying assumptions that they want to prove sometimes. They are, where are they getting their money from, and who is funding their studies. And so, I don't know. It's just very difficult to tease out sometimes. But like you said, the newer research is pointing toward its toxicity, and so it's just best to stay away from that.
Well,
Even if
I was trying to get at the bigger issue, which I think you're saying now, that it depends on who's funding some of the research,
Yeah.
because in some cases, the scientists' motives may not be, again, there may be built-in conflict of interest for
Mhm.
financial reasons. Um, yeah, a lot of times you hear uh, functional medicine called pseudoscience or quackery. And yet, on the other hand, I mean, functional medicine has a strong body of valid science that substantiates and proves many of the principles that we practice by. And yet, on the other hand, I think some of the science regarding the support of the pharmaceutical industry and the big food industry, you could argue that it's not valid. It's in some cases it's not even honest. It's not true. And we've seen a number of instances where over time there's been retractions even, and people have been found out to be having ulterior motives. So yeah, I think the problem of the science and the arguments of good versus bad is something that we need to continue to watch and look at. And I think again, looking at the money and the funding and looking for the areas of conflict of interest are something that's really important. Now, but
Right.
also let's talk for a minute about the lobbying, the industry of lobbying, and the way that that might influence our chronic health.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, this lobbying being this idea that these large industries with huge amount of resources are basically donating money to politicians, um, and then these politicians are influencing policies. So obviously, they're not going to be these. Some maybe there are some good politicians out there still, but I think, it seems like for the most part that they are not going to be. They're going to be going along with their donors' interests, basically, and this is part of that deep corruption that that we are not getting. They're not necessarily looking out for what is the best interest of the people of this country, which is what their job is supposed to be, what they were elected for, but that they are watching the interests of their where their money is coming from. And so, um, I just, to me, that system makes no sense. But
Well,
that is
it's
apparently
the
how it
system we
is.
have, at least right now.
Yeah, I
And
know.
I mean, obviously, we have evolved a system that doesn't work for the people, honestly.
Yeah.
And the question is, how do we move from what we've got to a system that does work for you and me and the rest of the American people. And it's certainly a huge thing, and it's got so many different aspects and angles. But you have to start somewhere. But I do believe that some of the policies, like for example, how many successful lobbyists today of even some of these big food industries were at some point themselves elected officials, and now they are no longer serving in the government, but instead they're collecting very, very, very valuable salaries representing these companies, going back and lobbying to their colleagues that were in the government. That's just one small example of something that could be changed. I mean,
Yeah.
said, hey, you can't do that. You can't
Yeah.
be a senator for 3 terms and then be the head of the lobbying department for one of these big food companies. You just can't do
It's
that.
a huge
It's illegal.
conflict. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But that, I think there's so many things like that that if we just looked at them, but then how are you going to get those laws changed? Because the people that will be changing the laws are the very same people that are potentially benefiting from knowing that someday they could leave their office and go get a big job. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
So
Right.
it's almost like the system is sort of self-perpetuating in that way. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. It's awful. I mean, I don't know if, you like to think that, if there's enough grassroots changes, if people just are, realizing these things and they're making other choices and basically voting with their dollars, right? Like not supporting these somewhat inherently evil corporations that are profit driven, then we can then that whole thing would collapse. But enough people have to realize that in order for that to happen. It's just it feels like we're fighting against a huge um you know sort of this huge nemesis or counterpart that
yeah,
it's
it's like a
just
big
it's
dragon
got to
in
be
a
more.
way,
Yeah, it's big dragon.
trying to
Yeah, exactly.
trying to
In a
fight
sense.
this fire-breathing dragon. But you're
Yeah.
right. I think a lot of people when they go into public service that they really want to represent the people. They would really want to take that oath of office that they take to support and defend the Constitution. I think they want to be real to that, and I think they want that to mean something to them. But the
Mhm.
incentives are just so huge for them to succumb to some of these conflicts and some of these mechanisms of corruption that have been kind of become entrenched, that it makes it very difficult. But again, I think it's just like we have to start, one stick at a time, trying to change the system as it is. And I think you mentioned earlier, and I think this is really true, that education of ourselves is certainly one of the places that it starts. And I think that in my own personal opinion, I mean, I was kind of cruising along with concerns about many of these things, but it wasn't until the internet and social media um, and all of these alternative news sources have started coming
Mhm.
out now that I've really had my eyes opened
Mhm.
wide. And I think a lot of Americans, and even not just Americans, but people across the world are beginning to say, wait a minute, we have been duped. I mean,
Mhm.
we've been fed a menu of that's not so healthy. I mean,
Yeah.
we've sort of been lied to in many respects.
Literally. Yeah.
And I think that the blinders are starting to come off, and people are starting to realize that they've got to be their own advocates for themselves and their families and their friends, and for the future, of the world, the environment, the future of the environment, and all these different things. But no, I really appreciate your comments, Amy. I think you've brought some really interesting things to light in our discussion today, and we've kind of hit this pretty hard. I mean, certainly there's a lot more we could say about it. We could talk more about individual toxins in the food. You touched briefly on fluoride, and we kind
Mhm.
of know about bromide and some of the dangers there, but some of these other things like high fructose corn syrup, that's such a big deal, and
Yeah.
glyphosate, that's just such a huge chemical. In my environmental practice, I measure a lot of urines for toxins. And I can honestly say, I've probably done hundreds of urinary assessments for glyphosate in my patients. I have had
Mm,
one person test negative for glyphosate.
really?
Yeah, and,
Wow.
and of course, I see a selected group of people that are sick from environmental exposures, but the only person who had zero glyphosate was a patient of mine that was born and raised in Poland and had only recently come to the United States. And they don't allow glyphosate to be used in agriculture at all in Poland and haven't for years. So I thought that was pretty telling to me.
That is very telling, yeah. That's a huge problem, I think. What do you think are like, well, what do you feel like the impacts of the glyphosate are, or what do you see as far as
Yeah, no, the more I've studied about glyphosate, the more I think it's probably one of the biggest problems that we have
Mhm,
from this whole concept of ultra processed foods. At first they
mhm,
were just using it as an herbicide, and then they developed the genetically modified wheat and corn that was not killed by the glyphosate. And so that allowed them to use even higher and higher amounts of it. And all the while, the company that manufactured it was putting out science that it was perfectly safe. And then it wasn't until quite a few years that they were able to prove and then pay awards to people that had had cancers that were directly linked to glyphosate. But glyphosate then
mhm.
started to be used as a drying agent for crops. So not even as an herbicide, but they found out that if they sprayed a crop just before harvest with glyphosate and then let it sun dry, and then they cultivated and harvested that crop, they could put it in the silos, and it was less likely to go bad from mold or whatever than if they hadn't sprayed it with the glyphosate. So first of all, they had a brand new market for glyphosate. They were able to sell tons more of it. We were able to have a lot more glyphosate on our food. And so the problem just seemed to perpetuate. But I think now finally we're beginning to, well, the industry is beginning to say, hey, it's more costly for us to produce and use glyphosate because of the awards we're going to have to pay to all of these injured people. And so
Oh, yeah.
finally, the economics of the situation may allow some changes to be made. But we do know pretty clearly now that glyphosate is a carcinogen. That's
Mhm.
pretty much been proven. But we're even finding that glyphosate, because it has a lot of chemical similarities to the amino acid glycine, there's actually a lot of research that shows that in our protein synthesis pathways of our body, a lot of times our cells mistakenly insert a glyphosate where a glycine should go. And the research on that's pretty dramatic. But a protein that has a glyphosate molecule where it should have a glycine molecule, it doesn't behave the same. It
Right.
folds a different way, it has a different enzyme function, it has a different structural function. So I think that's one of the big things about glyphosate. The other thing, most people don't realize that glyphosate is actually an antibiotic. It actually kills microbes. And so one of the things we know that a regular diet of glyphosate, like we all have, is one of the things that's dramatically affecting the health of our microbiome
Mhm,
and the
mhm.
diversity of the mix of good bugs in our bodies. So I think that's one of the things that's led to this loss of gut bug diversity that we all suffer from here in the United States. But no, it's a big deal in my practice, no question about it.
Yeah. I think it is interesting that it just also to mention about the glycine thing is that, glycine is also one of the individual components of glutathione. And so you need glycine to make glutathione along with cysteine and glutamine. But, basically glutathione allows you to detoxify and protects your body as an antioxidant from all these toxins and cellular damage. And so it's also basically poisoning our own detoxification system in a way as another effect. So,
Well, before we wrap up, Amy, thanks for your input.
okay.
I appreciate you. So this was
Yeah,
a fun discussion for me. Is there
good.
any other takeaways that you would like to express before we
Yeah.
wrap up?
Okay. Yeah, there's a couple things. Well, I kind of wanted to go into, so we've talked a lot about all the doom and gloom of this whole situation but you know, aside from, changing policies and all of those top down kinds of effects, what can we do to heal ourselves and to eat healthy? I think, like, so people need to understand, okay, if ultra processed foods are so inherently bad and they're linked to all of these chronic conditions. I don't even think we hit on everything, but as far as insulin resistance and obesity and anxiety and depression and infertility and hormone disruptions from these other, a lot of these chemicals are hormone disruptors, right? As far as those toxins that we're referring to. So leading to reduced sperm counts, but also the rise in diabetes, the rise in cardiovascular disease, um, can all be sort of, among many other things, can all be linked to these ultra processed foods. So as far as what do we do then? So how do we start to, what do we consider then an actually healthy diet? Um, so I think that it's like I was kind of mentioning in the beginning that sort of going back to our roots with an ancestral diet is important. Trying to at least come close, mimicking the diet of our ancestors, okay, which we had been historically hunter gatherers, and the majority of our calories came from animal foods. Okay. And so, not necessarily just meats, but I tend to think that organ meats are extremely nutrient dense foods that create a balance with the muscle meats. Also focusing on traditional fats, like saturated fats that come from animals, like um, and using those as well in our recipes, things like beef tallow or lard. These are totally normal things that have had a bad rap because of all the propaganda over the many years, but also other healthy oils like olive oil and coconut oil. And, so following those guidelines, um, and also including, of course, like vegetables in our diet and things that are whole foods that are just trying to get back to, okay, let's use our common sense and try to eat these foods that are less altered, okay? Because that is just this is kind of what we're designed to eat. And and then also the whole issue about dairy, I think, is a little bit controversial in some ways. Is dairy good or bad? In some ways, I don't think dairy is all created equal. And I feel that I tend to think if a person can tolerate some types of dairy, not everybody can tolerate all of these foods, for one, because of the issues you brought up with leaky gut and the ability, because a lot of people, as you have seen with leaky gut, develop food sensitivities to things that may, in other circumstances, be helpful. But I tend to be a proponent of raw dairy if a person can tolerate it. And of course, things like fermented foods that contain probiotics in themselves that also help to restore our microbiome, and things like fermented vegetables, sauerkraut and kimchi, and et cetera, and possibly raw fermented dairy. And then the issue about grains is that I think that grains are also difficult to digest, and they contain anti-nutrients naturally. And so it kind of does depend on how you prepare them. And that, those kind of methods are talked about in the work with the Weston A. Price Foundation. But again, that is sometimes, and it's not a one size fits all thing. And some people, when grains are properly prepared and soaked and, all of that, they still can't tolerate them. But it comes down to, I think, individual variances, and some people may be able to do that. But anyways, getting to this type of idea of, I just like to use common sense again. I mean, you look at these packages, and if you can't pronounce the names of these ingredients and you don't know what they are, that is not a good sign, And so, trying to stick with ingredients that you understand, and that you would be able to make in your own kitchen, because none of these foods that are ultra processed are even, it's not even possible to make them yourself. That's what we also have to understand. They're sort of this warped perversion of food in my mind. They are not like, I don't consider them real food. I mean, maybe they can, you can survive. You're definitely not going to thrive on them, basically. And of course, we know that over time the outcome is going to be negative, and it's certainly not something I want my kids eating. But it's just our culture it's so pervasive in our culture. It is somewhat difficult to stay away from, but we do our best in this, and try to minimize that as much as possible. Um, but yeah, so that's something I just wanted to talk about too. And of course, I didn't touch on every food group, but like eating whole fruits, and possibly nuts and seeds, and eggs, and it's just limiting the amounts of these known toxic ingredients. Choosing to avoid the industrial seed oils and the refined sugars, and the high fructose corn syrup, and the flours as well. So as much as we can do that, I think that we'll see an improvement in our overall health of each person, and hopefully the country.
Yeah,
As
and as
more
far as some other things that people can do, at Forum Health, we are a group of practices across the United States where we have practitioners that are trained and have experience in just the things that we talked about today. So if you're interested to have an opportunity to interact with one of our providers, you can follow some of the links, Forum Health Incorporated, and try to get in touch with the provider. The other thing that I can recommend that's been very helpful in my practice is we also have a group of eating and nutrition coaches that works with our practices to specifically offer people guidance in terms of a healthy, less toxic, more nutrient-rich eating plan that works for them. And so that's also resources that we have available within Forum Health. And again, you can just contact our organization at the numbers that you can see in the website, and we will try to put a link with the video to where you can get access to that in the future. So I think we'll kind of wrap it up there. I did want to say that, again, this is a video in a series, and we have some upcoming videos. For example, we're going to talk a little bit more in an upcoming video specifically about all the many toxins in the environment, not just the ones in the ultra-processed foods, but Dr. Berke mentioned earlier about biotoxins. We'll talk a little bit about that, and might even talk about some of the physical toxins in our environment, such as Wi-Fi and 5G and Bluetooth. We're going to probably have one on children's health and how do we protect our children from some of the issues that can contribute, because as Dr. Berke mentioned, we are seeing the numbers of cases of things like obesity and childhood diabetes and autism and asthma and peanut allergies pretty much going through the roof. So clearly we don't have a very good handle on things where they are now. And we'll talk in future episodes too, more about some of the more practical ways that we can encourage our bodies to detox more effectively, which I think will be interesting for people as we present that. So Amy,
Thank you so much. Yeah.
I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. And thanks so much for being with me on this one.
Hi, Dr. Saxena here, Chief Medical Officer at Form Health. Thanks for visiting our channel. Make sure to subscribe to get the latest insights and information on functional and integrative medicine.